This out to all the attendees, registered, everyone here. If you are joining us after the fact on demand, thanks for joining us post live session. Really quick introduction. My name is Greg Kulowick. Have about 20 years in education as a high school history teacher, then as an academic technology consultant, currently as a director of technology, and I do a whole lot of support with schools and districts on integrating technology and now a lot of artificial intelligence into their schools and classrooms. So what we are going to try to do tonight is navigate this 2-year experiment that no one particularly signed up for. And that's how I like to frame everything, especially lately these days. So I'm glad that that's resonating with some folks, Rob, especially. I could see that maybe brought a little chuckle to you there. I like to think of it that way to maybe put people at ease of like, while we're going to try to explore this idea of developing policy and developing quality practice, um, it's almost an impossible target to hit. When I hand the slides off to all of you as well, one thing that I want to point out is anytime I have like a little computer pointer finger on any of my screenshots, it means it opens up to a resource. So one way to think about this, like this experiment we were all thrown into, is this really helpful piece by a former colleague of mine, Justin Reich, at the Teaching Systems Lab at MIT, just kind of explaining this idea that every other bit of academic technology up to this point was technology that schools had to adopt. So going one-to-one was like, we have to get school board funding and approval, and there has to be training programs, and devices need to be ordered. And with all of that, schools and teachers need to go, we're willingly taking this technology into our environment. And generative AI was unlike anything else, about 2 years ago, where it just showed up. And one of the challenges of this particular topic is that, like, it's this double-edged sword of whether we acknowledge or we ignore, whether we promote or we ban. There's so many potential pitfalls and risks and opportunities on both sides of that, which we're going to try to address from a really balanced perspective tonight. Um, and unlike any other bit of technology, whatever approach a school district takes, like, students are using it. In some ways, you could argue then the beneficial path is to be wildly proactive and adopt a really kind of like open and progressive policy or guideline, because students are using the tools. You could argue it's our obligation to teach them how to use them in meaningful and thoughtful and productive ways that don't remove too much friction for their learning and creates a really good environment. On the other side of it, the really transparent side, is almost every terms of service agreement with all these big consumer tools say that students should not be using them unless there's like a sign off. And I've worked with a handful of districts where they have a sign-off sheet for students ages 14 to 18. Most districts don't do that. And we're in this really tricky spot, and I want to kind of frame it that way. I always like to play this game in a lot of sessions that I do, and it's to help develop some really quick and easy understanding of like what is actually going on when we're talking about generative AI or generative technology. So let's do this. You can do it in the chat because we're not face to face. If I were to start the phrase, and I'll put it in the chat for you, peanut butter and then I abruptly ended that phrase, what would you say next? And you can type it in the chat for me. If you're to end that phrase, peanut butter. Thank you, Cheryl. You win. I'll send you a special gift all the way to California. Yeah, it's jelly, right? So thank you for all playing the game the correct way. You answered exactly how I wanted you to. The reason why I like to do this, and I often get the question of like, how do we help students understand generative AI or generative technology? It's engaging in activities like this. Why did you answer jelly? You have background experience, you have context, you've been trained to answer it jelly. Like, there's other answers. If we played it again and I said peanut butter and, you would type other things, right? Why does generative AI, why does Claude, and why does ChatGPT, why do they answer it this way as well? Oh, I'll take care of that. Give me 1 second here. Here we go. Why do they answer it that way as well? It's because they've been trained on a massive data set. And when the words peanut butter and, we're going to put this really simply, when the words peanut butter and appear together, the fourth word that has to appear 99% of the time is jelly. The difference is humans have context, humans have experience, humans understand those three words. There's meaning, there's memory, there's taste, there's connection to people, there's context for the answer. Whereas generative technology, there's no context for the answer. It's just pattern matching. And with that, while we're going to explore these ideas around policy, I want to build a little framework and like a way to think about generative technology before we get into kind of like what are the approaches we can take towards developing guideline or policy. And this is a critical one, and I encourage everyone to adopt this way of thinking in some capacity. The language we use matters. The language we use around students matters. The language of artificial intelligence, I think, is too broad and too big, and it creates too much confusion in schools right now around what is this actual technology, what are chatbots that we have access to. Instead of artificial intelligence, I'm encouraging, and I try to use the language myself, of generative technology or maybe generative AI. If we shift over to generative technology, and that's the approach and the language and the mindset that we take, I think we're maybe providing more of a service to our students with talking about it for what it is. It's sophisticated pattern matching. So I'm sharing this link here to this, and I'm going to drop the link in the chat for you. This wildly helpful piece by Leon Furs. And I love the language here that chatbots don't make sense, they make words. And I dropped the link in the chat there for you. So these tools, these chatbot environments, ChatGPT, Claude, whatever your favorite platform is, they're programmed to mimic patterns of human language, not to genuinely understand or make sense of it. That's the fundamental difference that I think all teachers and students need to understand. You have meaning around peanut butter and jelly, fluff, honey, soy sauce, whatever it is that's your connection to peanut butter, and these machines just recognize patterns of words. The mechanism can produce text that appears to be meaningful, but it's essentially sophisticated pattern matching. The way I like to think of this, and before we get into policy and guidance or how are we going to navigate all that really complicated stuff, to me, it's mindset. Generative technologies are word generators, not truth generators. I think about these tools as I've been using language for 2 years of AI as a thought partner. I like even thinking about more specifically, it's not just a thought partner, it's a word generating partner. It's an idea generating partner. It is not a truth generator. That's the role that humans play. It's not an accuracy generator. And I'm aware you might be like, well, Search GPT is now available. Like, yes, that technology is emerging as well, but it's still generative in a sense that it's going to generate an output that is words that are sophisticated pattern matching, that have no context, no understanding, no framework for why those words are put together. But at the same time, we have to be honest about it and go, my gosh, can they be wildly accurate? Yes. Can they be close to truth? Yes. Can they present as human intelligence? Yes. But that's very different than truth, than human intelligence, and then understanding. Two more wildly helpful pieces. Like if I was going to say, and I know I'm moving very quickly because we have a lot to cover in 45 minutes. If I was going to say there's a couple of pieces that would be required reading, I'm dropping them in the chat for you. This piece here by the Wolfram Alpha blog, what is ChatGPT doing and why does it work? What's happening? I would say this is required reading for anyone who's going to go down the path of being responsible in some capacity for developing guidelines or a framework or expectations in their school or district. The second piece I dropped in there is really helpful because it rips out all the kind of like fancy, possibly unnecessary jargon and just boils it right down to what is absolutely happening. But we could boil it right down to Leon's phrase of chatbots making words, not making sense. And with that, we're going to keep going. My second experiment that I highly recommend that everyone engage with teachers in your school, with students, if you're starting to introduce this to students, it's the challenge to make generative technology apologize for its output and then pivot and provide a contradictory output, almost make it flip 180 degrees. So the reason why I do this is twofold, and let me demonstrate it for you here quickly as well. My challenge was, hey, ChatGPT, make me a list of the most significant Nike sneaker designs of all time. It goes, no problem, here's the list. There's the top 5 on the list. I come back with, you seem pretty certain, but you left off a few critical designs. I'm dissatisfied. I appreciate the feedback. Here's another way to think about it. There's the list, right? I push back and go, I'm still puzzled. I don't get why you're doing this. This doesn't make sense to me. This is really problematic. It comes back and generates with, I'm sorry for the previous response not meeting your expectations. Here's a new list, and it's a different top 5 list than the one that was previously generated. Now, if we think about the prompt that I gave it of what are the sneaker designs, like that's irrelevant, has no meaning, no real significance to anything. But I think about this in terms of both educator and student use. If students are navigating a problematic topic, something with a moral dilemma, something that is wildly critical or sensitive, and they receive an output from the tool and they're not innately thinking, I can't trust this right away. It's not an authority, even though it presents as one. It's not truth, even though it'll present as accuracy and truth. And it really can't be trusted. And I'm wildly optimistic. But the reason why I say it can't be trusted is if you can get it to stop, apologize, and pivot immediately, why can you trust the first answer but not the second? Or how can you trust the second one but not the first one? And that comes back to the idea that if we put this technology in its place as a word or idea or concept generator, not a truth and accuracy and kind of like moral compass generator, then it's completely fine to use it because we're recognizing the limitations and recognizing the potential. It's like deal with the dilemmas, deal with the problems, put them in their place, and go, if we can look at it that way as a generative pattern matching tool that can make reasonable output, but it's not truth, then we can take it as ideas to push our own thinking further. And that's the way that I really like to present this concept. So we're going to get a bit into AI literacy, and I want to kind of like touch on it right now because we're going to circle back to a little bit later. One way I like to think of this is AI literacy is not AI use, right? And like, let me clarify this a little bit. What I keep coming across again and again is the way that we're going to get students to truly understand what's going on with generative technology is to have them use the tools. Is it beneficial to use the tools? Absolutely. I think the first two steps are the most critical ones as well, though. It's what is happening when I type words into a chatbot, what is happening that makes it generate that output? It's not intelligent, it's not aware, it's not magical, it's not thoughtful, it's not correct. It is generated output. What is happening is it's sophisticated pattern matching. We don't need to get into the technology behind it. The two articles that I dropped in the chat are more than enough to dig in and truly understand it. But even playing those simulations and playing those games with students can be wildly helpful. The next phase here, if I can understand what is happening, then I can go, when should I use it? And the way I look at this is it has to be used in a student-centered or human-centered framework. One example, I was working with a district the other day in South Carolina, and the teacher was telling me how they were having students engage with some brainstorming, and they went right to the generative technology to engage with the brainstorming. This is the topic. This is why we're exploring it. This is the end goal we have in mind. Can you generate 8 things we should consider to begin our brainstorming process? And the generative technology goes, no problem. Here's the 8 concepts. I got worried with that approach because I'm thinking now, how likely is it that those students are going to be able to walk away from any one of those 8 concepts? If we think about when it should be used, to me, it's always post-human thought. Original human thought, then the generative technology can be used to counter the human thought, build off of the human thought, look for holes in the human thought, look for alternatives in the human thought. And it's a huge challenge. It's problematic to get anyone to use it in that way, but I think the way it's been pitched as a work doer and a task completer by all the AI companies implies that it should be used first to complete the task and solve the problem, as opposed to what I think should be happening in schools is students have to engage in original human thought. Then this tool might have a meaningful role if we determine that it can. Next one is why and how should I use it in this particular instance? And the why has to come down to it's going to help me think more deeply. How will be some prompt strategies that we'll get into a little bit later. And then the last one is how do I evaluate it? Are we teaching students to push back? Are we teaching educators to model pushing back on the tool, questioning the tool, doubting the output? Not that we think it's not valuable, but if you can get it to change the output, then we have to be critical of the first output or the first iteration of the output. With all of that, again, kind of front loading this idea of we have to have a really kind of like critical and deliberate mindset going into this. I was on a call last night with this fantastic private school, and with business leaders in the community and parents in the community on the call. And we were kind of like talking about and exploring generative AI. And one pattern of thought that I saw emerging again and again was generative technology is being used in the business world. It's being used in industry. It's being used in the real world. We have to prepare students to use these technologies. And the perspective and the language that most people bring to the conversation is an AI centric one. The tools are here. The train has left the station. We have to teach children to use it effectively. And the lens is if generative AI can complete the task, then the task is no longer valuable. And I think we have to flip the way we look at it and not look at things that happen in schools and go, if generative AI can do it, then should we have students do it anymore? I think we have to look at it the other way and keep everything student or human centered. Do we find value in human completion of this task? Because generative AI can write a 5-paragraph essay doesn't mean that students should never write it. If there's value and skill and ability and intention and purpose with students doing the work, it doesn't mean because the technology can do it, they shouldn't be doing it anymore. It means if we can find value in it as a school community, as school leaders, as teachers, then we can go to the next step and go, might generative AI play a role in this? And only if it's not going to remove every little bit of necessary friction to ensure student learning. Unfortunately, I think this is the perspective people are taking because the technology is moving quickly and it's wildly impressive, and we're trying to navigate the technology. And I think we have to start on this side. All tasks, evaluating them and going, do they have value if the student does it? Forget the AI. Remove that from the equation. If the task has value, students can continue to engage in it. Generative AI might have a role in supporting them with thinking more deeply, with navigating the task, but not completing it and going, the task doesn't have a place in this environment anymore. With all of that framing, and we're about a third of the way through, so we're kind of right on pace. With all of that framing, now we can shift over to, if we're thinking about it in the right way, it's a word generator, it's a pattern matching tool, it's an idea generator. It is those things. It's fantastic for those things. It is, I don't believe at this point, to be used for truth reliance, for generating factual information, even though sometimes it can be a little bit problematic there. So the purpose of the session, maybe the reason why you are so compelled to join us, is maybe you're trying to develop a policy in your school, or you're trying to develop a policy that you can discuss with your school board or your leadership team or your department. I think starting with the target of like, let's write policy, we actually have to work way backwards first and then circle back to it. As opposed to developing AI policy, we have to work backwards and go, what do we believe about this technology? How have we established a sense of literacy around what is the technology doing? How is it designed? What are the pitfalls? How does it generate the output that it generates? What are the ethical kind of like challenges around the technology? What is the bias that's kind of like baked right into the technology that we have to be aware of? What is the harm that it can do to learners in terms of removing too much of the friction, removing too many of the barriers, removing meaningful experiences? I'm even exploring ideas recently around like stress and anxiety that these tools are generating, because students are going, if that tool can generate a perfect output in 30 seconds and I generate an imperfect output in 4 hours, what's the point of me doing the work? It doesn't mean that we're going to walk away from the technology, but don't start with time to write the policy. Go back a step and go, what do we believe about generative technology in our community? Some schools I work with, they're taking these wildly aggressive, forward-thinking stances. We want kids building the chatbots. We want them building their own data sets. We want them using the tools extensively because they're going to use them the moment they walk off of our campus. A completely reasonable approach if that's your belief set. We have other schools that I've connected with that are like, we don't believe this has a role in a teaching and learning environment. It's going to remove too much of the friction, remove too many of the experiences that we value. That's your belief set. Then you can maybe think about developing policy. But I think you should even go back a step further and go, what do we believe about teaching and learning? What is the most valuable thing that students can engage with in a classroom? What do we believe is the best learning environment? If we can move all the way back forget policy, forget generative technology. What do we value about teaching and learning? Then we can move forward and go, okay, let's align that with our belief set about generative AI. Then maybe we move forward, and notice the language changed here. I change it specifically from AI policy to AI guidelines. Very strategic move on my part. I've been saying this for about a year and a half now. If we develop policy right now, it's going to be outdated before the policy can get approved. If policy gets approved by a school board, gets put in a handbook, becomes part of an AUP, it's going to be outdated. Like, look at the recent emergence of like the computer interactive generative technology that Anthropic made, and ChatGPT will have theirs out soon, where you can run your language model on your computer and it will complete tasks for you. Leon Furs, who I mentioned earlier, he had this amazing experiment he was running where he dropped Anthropic's new kind of like computer use AI onto a fake simulated learning management system, and it started completing discussion forum posts and handing assignments in that were incomplete. So like that's not going to be in any policy that any school develops. So like I truly believe that the idea of policy is maybe even a problematic path to go down, and it should be AI guidelines, AI belief statements, because they're allowed to be changed. They're more fluid. We can adapt them and modify them as necessary as the technology evolves just way too quickly to even possibly keep up with. So now we come to the challenging part, right? There's almost two paths that I believe we can go down. And some schools are going down the allow path, and some schools are going down the ignore path. It just depends on the comfort level, the pace at which a school can adopt new technology, or even have the time and energy to investigate the technology, develop advisory councils, like all these steps that possibly need to happen. But I think it's even a little bit more intricate than that. If we look at this spectrum of AI use, or it could even be AI educator use, or AI student use, or AI school leader use, or AI administrator use, we can go on the left and go, we're going to promote the use of this, right? We recognize what happens in the world. We recognize where businesses are trying to adopt this. We even recognize the problematic nature of higher ed AI policy, where students are increasingly worried about getting caught using these tools when the policies are unclear and the guidelines are kind of like foggy at best. But we can still push forward and go, we're going to promote it a little bit, kind of on the more kind of conservative side. We're going to allow it. We move on to the other side of this spectrum. We're going to ignore it, or all the way on the far right, we're going to ban it. And I've seen the approach in all environments. And there's no right way to do it. There's no reason to be hypercritical of one over the other. There's benefits to landing on the left side. There's benefits to landing on the right side. Right? There's no evaluation. There's no right way to do this. It has to go back to, what does your school community believe in about AI? What does your school community believe in about teaching and learning? Then establish what your guidelines are going to be. But these are what I think are four important questions to ask, two on either side of this framework. If we go on the promote or allow side, if we develop guidelines that goes, for example, a lot of schools are going with a model of students are allowed to use generative technology at the classroom teacher's discretion. Now, problems with that. Have we thought about student data privacy? Have we thought about terms of service? Have we thought about students understand the ethics behind using AI? Do teachers feel comfortable using it? Do we have do we have multiple use cases? Do we have we taught students how effectively prompt? There's all these challenges. But if we go with the left side of we're promoting or allowing it, we have to ask critical questions like, what skill is going to be lost if we promote the use of generative AI? And conversely, what is going to be gained if we promote or allow the use of generative AI? You could argue there could potentially be skill loss if the tools are not used in a really thoughtful way. You could also argue there's much to be gained if students know how to manipulate these tools and unlock some creative thinking, remove barriers that no longer have to be there because the technology can help them uncover their own thinking, make ideas more accessible, simplify complex concepts, right? There's this huge benefit here. Alternatively, you could go, there's tremendous skill loss if we promote it. There's potential for it. I was kind of experimenting with a tool the other day. You can sit in a teacher's lecture, have a generative technology, something like Otter AI or whatever audio to text transcription tool you want. It will record the entire lecture or convert the entire YouTube video into a transcript. It will automatically generate a study guide, automatically generate study cards, like the old index cards you would write on. And some folks look at that and go, oh my gosh, it removes so much of the tedious work. This is wildly beneficial for the learner. But you could also look at that and go, there's a loss there, right? The inherent process of creating your outline, of making the index cards, like that is the valuable experience. And that's all been ripped away from the student. All of the friction in learning is gone, and there's no barrier to entry anymore. You could also look at that and go, that's a wildly beneficial experience. It just depends on what your community values. But on the promoter allow side, what I want to shift to next is thinking about, if we're going to promote it or if we're going to allow it, we have to have a wide understanding of like, what are all the varied use cases going to look like? And that's why I developed this kind of like AI use spectrum framework, or this AI use spectrum kind of pathway to think about. On the left-hand side of this, and we're going to go, students should use the tools, right? Even if you adopted the language of like level 1, 2, 3, or 4 use cases. Level 1 is complete the task in its entirety. I have my challenge, I have my question my teacher gave me, I have the task I need to complete. A student would take that, drop it into a chatbot, and the chatbot cranks the output out. It's copy and pasted into a document. The language here that I think can be really helpful to talk to students is this middle layer here of the amount of human energy that's remaining. If the AI tool completes the task, the human battery is full, the amount of ownership of the ideas is minimal, if non-existent at all, right? If, however, we move to level 2 use, and this is where I think it gets interesting, maybe a little bit problematic, and it creates some challenges around, do we think this is okay? Here are some of my ideas, turn them into a final product. Is there human energy involved? Yes, not a ton. But I was giving the model the other day of, imagine if, your students in my history class and we're exploring something like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. And you, for example, you've done the readings, you've looked at the primary source excerpt, you've watched the video, you've engaged in in-class discussion, and you're able to write down in your notebook, here's 4 bulleted points that I know and understand about Marxist theory. Here's a question that I have about his idea, and here are 2 critical opinions and evaluations that I have. I'm going to take those bullet points, drop them into a chat bot, and go turn that into a final product. You could argue that that is removing too much of the meaningful task from the student. You could also argue that there are students where turning their ideas into a viable output is an unreasonable barrier, and this might be a powerful use case for them. A little more human energy is expended, a little more ownership of the ideas. But at level 3 and 4, this is where I think it gets really interesting. I think it becomes a viable use case, and I encourage schools to talk about the use of generative AI at levels 3 and 4. Here is my formulated idea. What do you think I'm missing? Massive amounts of human energy. The student engaged with original human thought. They created a final output. They evaluated their own work. Ideally, they talked with a peer. And then instead of the human, right, we're going to engage with the human first. And then instead of kind of like walking away and completing the task, then we turn to the generative tool, which is infinitely patient. It will create infinite responses to our prompts. It will have an infinite number of perspectives and ideas and angles to help us examine our own thinking. And we can go, this is my output. This was the goal of my output. These are the standards my output is going to be evaluated against. Help me understand what I might be missing from my final product. A teacher was sharing a story with me the other day where she was working with a group of students that were writing letters to the CEO of Coca-Cola, talking about the packaging, advertising, the new marketing campaign, and kids were coming up with different perspectives to provide advice and guidance and market research, these really cool projects in their business class. They did all of the work. They went to a generative AI tool, and they basically dumped in their report and said, help us understand what we're missing. I even pushed it a little bit and said, why not have the generative AI role play a CEO from Coca-Cola, give the chatbot some context, have it tear apart the proposal, and then have the students evaluate that feedback and go back and maybe rework their proposal. How do we do this? How do we do level 3 work? We put the technology away. I worked with students 2 years ago at Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania, and we engaged in this project called Debate the Expert. Day one, we put the technology away. We put students in groups. We had them pick a topic they were all interested in their group. We had them write down 6, 7, 8, 9 ideas on index cards that they knew about the topic that they were passionate about. Day two, they got some technology, Chromebook, iPad, whatever they had. They could engage in web-based research to kind of bolster their ideas. Day three, they started to put that all into a digital document so we could see their work, right? These are the arguments we're going to make. This is the evidence we have. This is what we can say about our points. Day 4 and day 5, they engaged in a debate with ChatGPT about the topic. We wrote a really thorough prompt. They would present one side of the argument, let ChatGPT come back with a 45-sentence response, and then they would engage with the next argument, and we go back and forth, so on and so forth. And then on day 5, they recorded all of their voices reading their side of the argument. They converted ChatGPT's output to audio using a tool like ElevenLabs, which is text to audio, and they mixed it down in GarageBand and made a podcast episode debating the expert. It was on that kind of like level 3 use case. But the critical thing here is the design of the experience, which was put the technology away on day one, work offline in a space to give you the time and space to develop original human thought. We don't need to use the tool right away. It doesn't need to cloud your thinking or influence your thinking at all. And that brings us to what I think is the most powerful use case, maybe not in industry, maybe not in task completion, maybe not in efficiency, but maybe the most powerful use case in education, which is, this is my final idea, generate questions to help me think deeply. This is my essay, this is my presentation, this is my poem, this is my short story, whatever it is. I don't care what your output is. I'm not interested in your generative word linking in terms of influencing my thinking or giving me things that I should think about. It's generate questions. I want to do the thinking. And I think that's a powerful use case there. And if we can start to think about it in a spectrum of use cases, then we can start to develop meaningful ways to guide student use that's like thoughtful and meaningful. The challenge here, it's not going to be easy to get 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds to use it at a level 3 and 4. But you can make a counter argument and go, if we don't teach them how to use it at a level 3 and 4, they might not know how to use it at a level 3 and 4. We don't want it devolving to level 1 use case and then trying to catch students that are using generative AI to not complete their work. But it's that double-edged sword of like, if we promote it, we better have meaningful processes that give them space to engage in original human thought and then leverage the tools to help them think more deeply. Another challenge here, right? Everything is double-edged with this technology. Research that points to the fact that like when humans use generative AI, they're across the board, the quality of their writing goes up, but the uniqueness of their writing dips. So even if we were to use these tools at a level 3 and 4, there's still that potential problem that the ideas that are generated might be more of the path of sameness than uniqueness. The questions that are generated might push students down the path of sameness and not uniqueness, because the generative tools supporting writing point students towards increasing the quality or the clarity of the writing, but not the uniqueness of the human output. And that's a problem to grapple with. On the other side of this, right, and we're kind of like building towards the point where we might have the capacity to develop guidelines or policy. If we go down the path of ignore or ban, two problems. Are skills going to be missed if we ignore or ban the technology? Or will there be specific abilities that are preserved if we ignore or ban the technology? And I think the answer is yes to both. But here's the important thing I think we have to consider. If we're going to go, maybe not ignore or ban, but maybe restrict use, or we should have that little like maybe in between. We're going to limit use or monitor use or prohibit use in all circumstances. What I'm worried about, and I know there were a few folks when they filled out the intention to join this session tonight, there were a few questions of like, what happened in, there's a public school district south of Boston in Massachusetts here, where there's kind of like legal proceedings going on with a family bringing litigation against the school district because of the student use of generative AI. And I'm thinking, this is not a time for punishment. This is not a time for zeros. This is not a time for incompletes. This is not a time for generative AI detectors. This is not a time for I caught you. This is a time for restorative conversations around why a student might use the tool if they shouldn't have used the tool. The best example of this, and then Rob, I'll check out your question. The best example of this was an article that I came across that outlined how to have challenging conversations for students when we think they have used the tool, when maybe they shouldn't have used the tool, right? So in that critical conversation, if a student says, yes, I used it, and maybe I shouldn't have, or I didn't get permission, or it's been really clear in the policy that we're not to use it, critical questions like, how do you usually handle challenging assignments without using AI? At what point did you decide to use AI? What made you turn to the AI instead of me or a peer? Did you try any other strategies before using AI? Like, these are restorative. We want to investigate. We want to be transparent with students. We want to help them navigate this technology where there's no right or wrong way to use it. And these are outstanding questions. And I'm going to drop the link to this article in the chat. These are outstanding questions to guide those types of challenging discussions. Alternatively, if a student says no, so if all indicators point to the fact that the student used the generative technology, but they say, no, I didn't, helpful questions. Can you walk me through your process on a portion of the work? What part of the paper did you find most challenging? What part of the writing process do you enjoy the most? Can you discuss a specific argument or point in your paper that you're particularly passionate about, that you struggled with, that you find align with your own thinking? So it's giving space for the discussion. And this is to avoid the idea of like generative AI text detectors, which are wildly problematic at best, and like I would say dangerous and damaging at worst. So we have this huge spectrum. I think if you are going back to your school or district or your school committee or your leadership team and going, we need to have these discussions, what's a really reasonable entry point for us to begin to have these discussions? I think it's looking at a spectrum of use like this and going, if we go on the promote or allow side, what are the benefits and drawbacks? If we go on the ignore or ban, or maybe we go limit right down the middle, what are we going to miss in terms of the student experience? And what are we going to preserve that we truly value in our institution that might be unique from your school compared to another school? So it's 8:38 Eastern. We are flying right now. I wanted to outline 8 key considerations in terms of developing guidelines, right? So, and I'll work through each one of these relatively quickly. The one is student data privacy. And there are schools that are allowing students to use big consumer tools like ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or any big consumer tool that you can think of. If we have students using those tools, there is no student data privacy agreement that those products have signed off on in terms of student use with any state organization or private school district, right? Can mom and dad sign off on an AUP where students can use the tools? Yes, but we have to be critically aware of the fact that if a student drops their essay into it to get feedback, they're not getting the essay out. Right? If teachers are going to use it to provide feedback on student work, they're not getting the student work back out of there, the student's IP or any information. We absolutely cannot upload documents with sensitive information to them, which then might have student data connected with them. The other one that I've alluded to is the terms of service. If you read the terms of service of the big consumer models, oh, Greg, good question. So 2 questions we have to address. Rob's question, do teachers even know and want to know to use it at level 3 and 4, never mind with the kids? Rob, great question. Do teachers know how to use it at level 3 and 4? Maybe, maybe not, but it's our obligation to let them know about these wide spectrum. Like they can't, it sounds so simple, but like maybe they would never think to go use it down that path unless we point out that that's a way to use it, right? And there's ways to navigate these challenges. Greg, you pose a great question. Gemini inside of Google EDU does not share the data. Yes, but it's expensive to turn on. Microsoft Copilot, for example, puts you in a walled garden and doesn't share data out of Copilot. But I think most folks are unaware of this path. And I think especially with like turning Gemini on for teachers. There's an expense associated with that. So what I see most often is like people are going to the big consumer tools, but not thinking about student data privacy or terms of service. The terms of service points to 14 to 18 with parental consent, right? There are public school districts that are getting parental consent, but I think that's still a risky proposition considering the student data privacy agreements that these tools have not signed off on. The next one is approval, right? What I've seen a lot of schools doing where they want to empower the teachers, look for little pockets of innovation, not have a massive whole-scale adoption is going, it's up to the teacher to decide discretion on whether the tool can be used in the classroom or not. There's no right way to do it. Maybe we go down the path of going, the school across the board, the district across the board has to be on the same page. These are the age groups that are allowed to use it. These are the use cases that are reasonable. We've adopted a level 3 and 4 mindset. We understand the challenges and opportunities of generative technology, and we're good with a school level approval. Other institutions I've been connecting with are going, it's at teacher discretion. The policies outline clearly, AI can be used by students at teacher discretion. And then it's putting the burden on the teacher to develop what looks like meaningful use, to develop a process for students to document their use case and to make sure they're not offloading all of the thinking to the technology. Another key consideration is clearly communicating with the community, right? If we're going to adopt a new policy or new guidelines, having the community know and understand this is why we're adopting them. This is what we recognize about generative technology. This is what we value, and this is why we're moving forward in this path. 4 more critical ideas to think about. AI literacy, we've already talked about. It's tricky to define AI literacy. I look at it in terms of not using the tool, understanding why the output is what it is, and really boiling it down to sophisticated pattern matching of words. We go to the next kind of key consideration. Key consideration number 6 is AI ethics. So there's 2 ways that I think about that. One is the kind of inherent biased output that is generated by these tools, whether suggestions on writing leads towards Western style writing, or the images that are generated lead towards biased output. I have an activity that I do with groups where I'll show an image, have them look at the image, generative image, and then work backwards and go, what was the prompt that made that output? It is a wildly helpful exercise to get people to truly understand what we mean by bias with generative technology. A prompt of beautiful people outputs a population of people that is not inclusive, that doesn't have any level of diversity, and the people look one specific way. That's problematic, right? So the other side to AI ethics that we have to navigate is this like natural resource environmental impact. So blindly plowing ahead and not even having that discussion is problematic. What I hope to see, and like maybe the year to 2-year window, is the ability for schools to run local models trained on their own data sets that aren't kind of like having that significant environmental impact. I run a product called GPT for All. It's a local tool that you can install that runs a smaller language models that once the tool is installed, you can run it without an internet connection and it will generate the output because the language model is on your device. On your phone, you can install an app called Pocket Pal. It downloads a small language model. You can turn the cell connection off, turn off the Wi-Fi, and it will generate output for you because the language model is installed. So I think we have to address that idea of like the amount of natural resources. The Washington Post had a piece the other day that every prompt you write, every output that's generated, it's like dumping a bottle of water to keep these data centers up and running. Key consideration number 7 here are the use cases. That's that 1 to 4 spectrum. And then the last idea here is, are we going to develop policy or are we going to develop guidelines? And I think this is a time for guideline development, not policy development. Now, with all of that, it is 8:44. What I want to point you all to, and I'm going to give you the link to these slides as well, there are phenomenal resources emerging. The Office of Ed Tech just put out basically this massive toolkit for school leaders to work through to be able to go through specific phases. Oh, thanks, Helena. Specific phases. It's going to take a second to load on how to navigate all these challenges. Leadership teams can basically use this document to work through all of these three elements of understanding risks, safeguards, security, student data privacy, one of the concerns we talked about. Phase 2 is building your strategy and kind of like integrating that strategy. Phase 3 is guiding effective use. That's the use spectrums and evaluating the impact. So that's a wildly helpful guide. I put the link in the chat. UNESCO has two helpful ones, an AI competency framework for students, an AI competency framework for teachers. These could be wildly helpful sources, and I'm going to drop them in the chat right now. These could be wildly helpful tools to help develop a framework for how can we upskill our students in terms of leveraging the tools and understanding what they're doing. There's a link in here to some public school and private school AI guidelines and policies that I know some folks wanted to see, like specific examples. All of these are linked into the slides, which I'll provide for you as well. And then there's a really helpful spreadsheet that I stumbled across. It's higher ed, but it can be helpful nonetheless. And it has well over 100 different kind of like syllabus style policies from various institutions of higher learning and how they're adopting it in all different kind of disciplines, from art to law to marketing to literature, psychology, sociology, research documents. So this could be helpful language to kind of sift through in your kind of discipline domain. And I know it's higher ed, but we can pull some pretty interesting language out of this to think about how to craft our own. And I'm going to drop that spreadsheet in the chat. You can make a copy of that and kind of like sort by discipline and sort by keyword if you want. I can see a few folks jumped into it right now. All right, my goodness, we are flying there. I want to point you to one helpful resource. This was kind of like a jumpstart, get your thinking aligned with maybe being prepared to develop policy or guideline. If you work with educators and you want to kind of like spend more time looking at this from the education's perspective, I would encourage you to join me in 2025 as I'm going to run another round of AI is Here, Now What, designed specifically for teachers and school leaders. 3 live sessions with some follow-up resources in between to really dig into these topics, go hands-on, build our own chatbots, learn how to prompt effectively, look at what meaningful use cases look like in school. So I encourage you to join me there. It was an awesome 3-part session that I ran earlier in the year, and we're going to run it again right after the new year, starting in December. With that, what I'm going to do now is, give me a second, I'm going to drop the link to these slides in the chat. Let me open this up, get these out to all of you. If you've made it this long, there you go. I'm going to follow up with an email as well. The link to the slides are in the chat. You have access to those. My hope is that this has been helpful, that it's helping you think differently about maybe some problems you've been facing. It's helping you navigate these challenging topics. What I want to do now is shift over. Let me push it up. Is shift over to some time for a Q&A. If anyone wants to stick around, you're more than welcome to unlock your microphone. If you have any really particular questions, I'm happy to navigate those questions, whether it's policy related or tool related or whatever that may be. Oh, Greg, I appreciate that. Aaron, I appreciate that. Becky, I appreciate that. So let's do that. I'm going to turn the recording off at this point since we're going to shift to more of a Q&A.